We have reached critical mass. Good evening, everybody. I'm Eric Holzenberg, director of the Grill Your Club. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Grill Your Club members and other friends in the bookish community to this in a continuing series of online Zoom events about the art and history of the book and of prints. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our moderator this evening, Olivia Moy. Olivia is assistant professor of English at the City University of New York's Lehman College, where she specializes in 19th century poetry and poetics. She is the founder and director of the CUNY Rare Book Scholars, a wonderful group which introduces undergraduate students in the City University system to archival research in special collections by bringing them in contact with librarians and curators, book collectors, and antiquarian booksellers. Her first monograph, entitled The Gothic Forms of Victorian Poetry, is forthcoming with Edinburgh University Press. And next month, she will be delivering a lecture on John Keats' Latin American Afterlives at the Morgan Library. I will turn the podium over to Olivia for further introductions and so on. Olivia.
Thank you, Eric. So I'm going to introduce our two wonderful speakers today, starting with David Allen Richards, who is a longtime collector of the books and manuscripts of Rudyard Kipling, and his collection, now at Yale University's Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, is the largest in the world. He has written what is now the standard bibliography of Kipling, co-published in 2010 by the British Library and Oak Knoll Press, and he's written or co-edited two other books and numerous articles about Kipling, appearing in the papers of the Bibliographical Society of America, in the Kipling Journal, and in First Magazine. His History of the Yale University Library will be published this fall by Oak Knoll Press. Mr. Richards has served on the Grill Your Club Council as secretary and as chair of several committees from 2006 through 2019. He's currently the chair of the Yale Library Associates and will in July become president of the Kipling Society, headquartered in London. Mark Samuels Lasner, a senior research fellow at the University of Delaware Library, is a bibliographer, typographer, and recognized authority on the literature and art of the Victorian period. He has served as an honorary curator at several institutions and is active in numerous bibliophile organizations. His life's work, however, has been the amassing of a period library, one of the country's foremost private collections of books, manuscripts, letters, and artworks by British cultural figures who flourished between 1850 and 1900. In 2016, he donated his collection of 10,000 items to the University of Delaware Library. The materials in his collection, particularly those relating to Aubrey Beardsley, Max Beerbohm, Oscar Wilde, and other writers and artists of the 1890s, have provided the basis for numerous publications and exhibitions. Mr. Samuels Lasner is the author of The Yellow Book, a checklist and index, and a selective checklist of the published works of Aubrey Beardsley, among other works. He served for 2 decades as president of the William Morris Society in the United States, and has also served on the councils of the Grill Your Club, the American Printing History Association, and the Bibliographical Society of America. In 2003, he was awarded the Sir Thomas More Medal for private collecting of public benefit. Having organized many exhibitions in the past, he is currently at work on one co-curated with Margaret Stetz, titled Max Beerbohm, Master of Celebrity Caricature. It is scheduled, pandemic willing, for summer 2023 at the New York Public Library, 42nd Street. So the title of tonight's talk is Ex Libris, Lockwood Kipling, Rudyard Kipling, and Edward Burne-Jones. We'll begin with David Allen Richards, who will then hand things off to Mark Samuels Lasner, followed by hopefully a very fruitful Q&A session with both collectors. So please join me in welcoming tonight's speakers.
Thank you. In 2017, Olivia, if you'd put the first one up, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London and the Bard Graduate Center here in New York together mounted a major exhibition about the life and career of Rudyard Kipling's father, entitled John Lockwood Kipling, Arts and Crafts in the Punjab in London, memorialized by a sumptuously illustrated catalog with the same title. Here it is. In the multifaceted forays of the pater, as Kipling called him, into design of all types, ceramics, and sculpture, book covers and illustrations, international exhibition pavilions, architectural pavilion interiors, including the Durbar Hall at Osborne on the Isle of Wight for Queen Victoria, and even women's fashion. They were all reviewed and illustrated in this exhibit. Despite the seemingly comprehensive scope, however, one other medium in which Lockwood Kipling excelled was only marginally referenced and illustrated, the ex libris, which you all know to be Latin for from the books or from the library, or more familiarly, the bookplate. Even more unknown are the bookplates which Rudyard designed. Like Lockwood, he filled sketchbooks with drawings and caricatures. His editor at the Civil and Military Gazette noted in his memoirs, quote, "From his father, Rudyard Kipling has inherited the artistic tendency which leads him to fill any odd scrap of paper near his hand with some grotesque sketch of the incident or idea uppermost in his mind. Quaint and uncanny faces almost always adorned the edges of his writing blocks in the newspaper office at Lahore," close quote. He sometimes illustrated his letters to his family and friends and even strangers. Here's an example of that. This is a sketch of Santa Claus, supposedly using moose that he picked up in Vermont because he had to land because the reindeer were exhausted. And Kipling put this in a letter to a 13-year-old boy down in Kentucky. The habit didn't fall away over time. A man named Rupert Grayson was wounded at the Battle of Loos in September 1915, in which Rudyard's son John was killed, and was a house guest in Sussex at Kipling's home Bateman's in January of 1916. In his 1969 memoir, Grayson was to remember that on his visit, he, quote, "never saw a page of manuscript that he, Rudyard, had not decorated with little pictures down the margins. Quote, sometimes something my forebears bequeathed to me," he said one day to Grayson. For his father, Lockwood Kipling, Grayson continued, was a fine draughtsman. Now, the most extensive experiments in illustration of Rudyard's short stories may be found in the 35 drawings and 33 sketches that illustrate his Just So stories. And he did the title page for the second Jungle Book. Rudyard suggested to his American publisher that his father develop a, quote, "conventional totem, perhaps a lotus or by old trademark, the elephant's head with a lotus in its trunk," close quote, for the Doubleday outward bound edition of his collected works. And the son personally designed the Viking longship, which was for decades used as the front cover of the illustration on the American editions of his work in the dark green boards published by Doubleday. Rudyard did not lack pride in his talent. His presentation copy of a 1909 Doubleday pocket edition of Just So stories to a friend is inscribed, quote, "from the author and the artist," the plus underlined. Now, the design of book plates and their pursuit by collectors has a long history. The golden age for collecting and appreciating of book plates was roughly from 1890 to the mid-1920s, the decades which this talk covers. These printed or decorative labels pasted in a book inside the front cover or on the front free end paper have an ancient beginning. The earliest known marks of the ownership of books or documents dates from the reign of Amenphis III in Egypt, 1391 to 1353 BCE. And the oldest English example known is the modern sense of the word bookplate appears to be that of Sir Thomas Tresham, dated in 1585. Most were figurative designs, but sometimes the book owner had his portrait incorporated. This is an Albrecht Dürer bookplate of 1524. By the time of the Kiplings, father and son, no special style of decoration was in vogue, as had been the case in the era of elaborate family crests and coats of arms, which preceded it, for the first owner, of course, but also for family within which the ownership of the book would descend through inheritance. But by the turn of the 20th century, more personal, even whimsical or eccentric designs proliferated. The composition of individualized descriptive labels became recognized as a minor branch of a higher art, and collecting examples became a bibliographic subfield, as shown by the large collections in some university or other institutional libraries today. The best defined genre in Great Britain featured as subjects the library interior, stacks of books, these were known as book pile plates, the act of reading, and sometimes, as noted, likenesses of the book owner. This was the tradition then when Lockwood first tried his hand, Kipling's father. He did not date the book plate he created for himself, a self-portrait seated in a chair, viewed from the right profile and the waist up, book in hand and ever-present pipe in his mouth. The illustration here is taken from Lockwood's copy of the 1901 American edition of Kim, now in my collection at Yale, and with Lockwood's signature to the right. It reads Ex Libris at the top and John Lockwood Kipling at the bottom. And in the upper right-hand corner of the image bears the motto, you'll see it better in a few minutes, Fumus Gloria Mundi, smoke is the world's glory. But it is not the printed version of an inked design. Rather, it is a photographic version of a similarly titled self-portrait in terracotta oblong relief, now at Rudyard's home Bateman's in Sussex and provisionally dated circa 1890. The motto is a saying attributed to the 17th century Amsterdam town physician and poet W.G. van Fockenbroek, 1640 to 1670, which appeared on many Dutch genre pictures with the more subtle meaning that, quote, the glory of the world is only smoke. Lockwood's earliest bookplate was one designed for Andrew W.N. Spen, of which we know only from a diary note. The first one of which we know he did for the Lahore Museum, printed by woodblock, and appears to be one created in 1886 for the Lahore Central Museum, which he administered, again reading Ex Libris at the top, and within an elaborate floral design in a traditional Indian pattern, bearing the simple legend, Lahore Museum. 8 years later, in 1894, when Lockwood turned his hand to designing several bookplates, each were very personalized for their subjects. The first of these was an Ex Libris designed and engraved for his wife Alice's brother, Frederick W. MacDonald, which partakes of two of the English bookplate traditions described before. MacDonald is shown reading, sitting behind a desk within a high-ceilinged library, 8 shelves of books arrayed in rows behind him. The decorative motto, inscribed on a ribbon floating across the library ceiling, is In Angelo cum labello, in a little corner with a little book, from Thomas à Kempis, and was seemingly requested by MacDonald. The next bookplate is one for Guy Wyndham, which Lockwood created at about this date. This is a proof, and the initials are GPW, Guy Percy Wyndham, of the 16th, or Queen's Lancers, as it says at the bottom of the plate, which was a regiment posted to the Northwest frontier between 1890 and 1899. This design is comprised of two gorged greyhounds in profile, standing on their hind legs on two sides of a shield, the shield decorated with a lance topped by a pennon hanging from the branch of the tree against which the shield leans. E Libris, not Ex Libris, is at the top of the plate's double-framed ruled border, and 16 Lancers, the Queens, at the bottom. Now, whether a bookplate was ever made from this design is unknown, but years later there was another Kipling connection in 1925. Guy Wyndham, for whom this bookplate was designed, and John W. McHale, who had married Rudyard's favorite cousin, Margaret Burne-Jones, edited a 2-volume Life and Letters of George Wyndham, Guy's brother. And when George was the private secretary of Prime Minister Arthur Balfour, he was petitioned by Rudyard to put on the civil list for honors W.E. Henley, editor of the National Review, to which both George and Rudyard had contributed. Included in those letters, making it a Kipling first edition, was George's letter to the author dated 5 October 1906, enthusiastically praising Puck of Pook's Hill. This next image is Rudyard in his library at Nalaka, the house he built his first home in Brattleboro, Vermont. In June 1893, Lockwood Kipling, his father, arrived in New York City, not having seen his son since December 1891 in India. And during his visit to Rudyard's home, he placed an inscription across the fireplace, not quite visible here, of Rudyard's study, an excerpt from the Gospel of St. John, quote, "The night cometh when no man can work." That title was to be echoed in Rudyard's 1898 short story collection, The Day's Work. Now, this is a well-known photograph from the period of his son standing in his library, that newly constructed home, and this may have inspired the potter, as Rudyard Kipling called him, to propose doing a bookplate for all these books. This next image is Rudyard's bookplate done by his father in 1894. This is the most well-known of Lockwood's bookplate designs, and just 2 years after its creation, it was included in Charles Dexter Allen's Ex Libris Essays of a Collector, published in Boston in 1896 and in the library in the council room at the Grolier. This example pictured here has an even closer Grolier connection. It is the facsimile plate from the catalog of the Grolier Club exhibition of Kipling's books and manuscripts, mounted back in 1929. This Ex Libris is comparatively the most elaborate of all the bookplates Lockwood is known to have designed. 3 1/4 by 2 5/8 inches in height. Its central illustration is a left profile view of a man reading a very large book while smoking a hookah, or in Hindu, hukwa, H-U-Q-A, effectively enthroned in a canopied howdah, that's a word you've seen, atop an elaborately caparisoned elephant with Indian attendants on each side of the howdah. 4, the mahout, or the driver train with his goad, the ankus, Kipling wrote a Jungle Book story called The King's Ankus, and aft, that man tending the Raja's hookah. All 3 men wear turbans, and the pachyderm is draped in 3 different frayed edge rugs, one covering the top of its head, almost hiding its only exposed eye, and the other 2 overlapping down its broad side. The animal's passenger bears little resemblance to Rudyard. He's bearded, and his mustache turns up at the end, which is probably why the second 1909 version of this bookplate, which we'll see shortly and closely resembles Rudyard, has been used for so many studies, so many books about Kipling as their frontispiece. The Ex Libris label is at the base of the fabric below the howdah, as you can see. And the book owner's name, Rudyard Kipling, runs across the base in its own ornamental frame, all this centered within an elaborate ornamental pointed arch. The letters AD, Anno Domini, are in the lower left corner of the plate to be read against the lower right corner, 1894, beneath which, barely visible, are the designer's initials JLK, John Lockwood Kipling. The ground beneath is strewn with flowers and exotic leaves. The 2 carved pillars running up the plate's sides stand on what appears to be a stone platform bearing Kipling's name, Rudyard's name. And on the corners of the archway are matching parrots holding branches in their beaks. The level of detail is astounding. It's a tribute to the craftsmanship of Lockwood, but less apparent to the ordinary viewer, like me before I started reading about this, is the mythic background grounded in the legends of India, which informed the writers of Father and Son Kipling, the country where the father had gone from England with his young wife to work to teach the natives how to create ceramics, which could be shipped and sold to England, and where the son was thus born because of that trip in Bombay in 1865. The elephant in India is not merely an elephant, but it's another incarnation of the Indian god Ganesha, the son of Siva and Parvati, the god of good fortune who is elephant-headed, and whose depiction by Lockwood with a lotus in his curled trunk was to be found in all the cover illustrations for the Indian Railway Library paperbacks that made his son's reputation across the subcontinent. Here is one of those titles, The Story of the Gatsby. And you can see in the sort of publisher's title plate there at the bottom, the Ganesh with the lotus in his trunk. These paperbacks were sold for 1 rupee. They were left on the floor by passengers who had bought them, and the Indian trunk lines carried them all across India, and that's how Kipling got famous. By 1930, the Ganesha became such an individualized symbol for Rudyard and his books that he sought to protect his financial and literary interest in it by applying to the governments of the United States and Great Britain to register 3 forms of the device as a personal trademark. His applications were granted, and to him goes the distinction of possessing the only literary trademark device ever to be registered both in this country and England. But the relationship between father and son and its connection with the elephant-headed god has a deeper resonance in this ex libris, which you've seen, and we'll see again in a moment, which has been described as follows, quote, "In the Indian culture, the god of wisdom is the elephant-headed deity Ganesha. The elephant is symbolically an appropriate subject for a book plate, considering the high value placed on books and learning. However, there is also an Indian myth of the contest between Ganesha and his brother to see who would circle the world first. The brother physically circled the world, but Ganesha won by walking around his parents. The wisdom that parents comprise and with which they shape one's worldview is significant when examining this book plate, designed by a pragmatic father for his fanciful son," close quote. This next image is the revised version, and the one sees more often, by Kipling's father, done in 1909. Why did he do it? Beyond making the principal figure, to the extent that you can see the head of the man on the howdah, look like his son, Lockwood did rework the design. He left its primary features and structural arrangement substantially intact, but he replaced the AD in the former plate with an elaborate capital K there on the left, and on the right, 1909 instead of 1894. But he deleted his 3 initials as originally located beneath that date, although the K now on the left side could now stand in to identify the artist. He improved the legibility of the composition by moving the ex libris legend to the middle of the plate on a newly cleared white background of the elephant's upper body rug. It had been obscured in the original design. The bell suspended from the lowest body rug no longer sways to one side, it hangs straight down. And the flower in the elephant's trunk is now clearly recognizable as a lotus, echoing those Indian Railway paperbacks. And most importantly, the profile of the writer is now clearly Rudyard's, with no beard and his trademark mustache. And this variant was produced in 3 different sizes and inked in both brown and black with a hint of blue. Interestingly, from things in my own collection, I know that Kipling was still occasionally using his 1894 ex libris in his library for books added as late as 1923. This next plate is designed by John Lockwood Kipling for his namesake, his grandson, in 1906, his patronymically named grandson, John. Lockwood here designed a much simpler plate, but employing 2 design strategies repurposed from that created for Rudyard, as you've just seen. A rider atop a tall, striding animal, familiar in India, heading left with a saddlecloth, again, like the plate for Rudyard, bearing the plate's message. Little John is depicted atop a very tall dromedary with taut reins running in a straight line from its mouth to the boy's hands, and the cloth below the mounted rider reads on a white ground, Ex Libris John Kipling. As previously noted, John was killed at the Battle of Loos in 1915, and the plate pictured here is from the estate of his nanny, Mary Blakely. In the same year, Rudyard in 1906 was writing the stories which collected became Puckapook's Hill, in which his children, Elsie and John, were changed into those tales' characters, Una and Dan. He did not neglect Elsie. 2 years on, in 1908, for his granddaughter Elsie, who was then 12, Lockwood designed a final bookplate for one of his descendants. She was the only child of Lockwood and Alice Kipling to survive to old age. By then, the owner of the Cambridgeshire stately home known as Wimpole Hall, purchased with the inheritance of her father's royalties and the oddly site of my Cambridge May Ball in 1969. I didn't collect Kipling then, and I didn't take anything when I was there. The design exists only as a pencil and watercolor image. No printed plate seems to exist, and as with Lockwood's own ex libris, has a sculptural character. Its subject is a woman, considerably more mature than the very young teenager for whom it was made. And it is Sarasvati, the Hindu goddess of speech, learning, and the arts. She's seated on a large spreading lotus leaves, surrounded at her feet by smaller lotus blossoms, and playing a veena, a small Indian stringed instrument, all against the background of a large, circular, and scalloped backdrop. The letters comprising the ex libris at the top and the owner's name, Elsie Kipling, at the bottom are thick and white, not the spindly black ink calligraphy of the other plates, against dense ornamental floral backgrounds. Lockwood varied his style until the end, not afraid, as shown by his re-engraving of Rudyard's original ex libris in 1909, to modify an initial design concept, but never abandoning his heritage of India, which so influenced his career as an artist. Now, it may be queried why Lockwood never seems to have designed book plates for his wife Alice and their daughter Alice, known as Trix, the other two members of the family square. That was Mrs. Kipling's term for the foursome taken from a defensive formation employed by the British Army. Some of Alice's books remain in the library at Rudyard's home, Bateman's in Sussex, mostly poetry, but they do not bear her bookplate. Lockwood's artistic service to his wife and daughter seems to have come in another way. This next image is of an advertisement of a book written by the daughters and the mother. During the years, the three, Trix before she got married and the parents lived at Tisbury in England, she and Trix collected their poetry for a book published in 1902 titled Hand in Hand, Verses by Mother and Daughter. Now, this is taken from the Lockwood Kipling catalog, and he produced here one of his most elaborate bas-reliefs, and is a form he'd used for his personal book-like design, which we saw, and for his illustrations for his son's book, Kim. His frontispiece shows two women, readily identifiable as Alice and Trix, sitting at the edge of Bombay Harbor, framed by twisting but roughly symmetrical palms on the left and right borders of the image. Alice, the mother, it was a noted beauty even in her maturity, and in this double portrait, she's paired with her daughter, seated on the ground beside her mother, on whose lap a book is open, with the mother Alice's right arm over her daughter, looking like a teenager she was when she first arrived in the mother, when she arrived in Bombay. Emblazoned on the lower fifth of the image in matching left and right scrolls are the names of the volume's co-publishers, Elkin Matthews in London, which Mark has taught me to print with only one T, and Doubleday in New York. It would not have taken many modifications to convert this to a dual bookplate, or two single ones. Lockwood, it should be noted, was not the only bookplate designer in the extended family. Alice's sister, Georgina, Rudyard's beloved Aunt Georgie, had married Edward Burne-Jones, the pre-Raphaelite painter, and they first entertained the 7-year-old Rudyard at their home, the Grange in Fulham, at Christmas in 1873, the first of what became 4 annual visits, while Rudyard was boarded in England to escape the childhood diseases of India. The house was filled with Burne-Jones' cousins and the children of his aunt Agnes Pointer and her husband Edward, and of Edward's longtime collaborator in design, another expertise of Mark's, William Morris. The home on these Christmas visits became a haven for the boy, then long separated from his parents in India. They didn't come back. He was isolated and traumatized in his foster home in Southsea. It's called the House of Desolation in his bitter short story, Baba Black Sheep. At the Grange, he first became a journalist, drawn into the production of his first magazine called The Scribbler, which was a homemade magazine of which Jenny Morris was the editor. He was to remember in his posthumously published members something of myself, quote, "One hastened along the passages where unfinished cartoons lay against the walls," close quote. When in time the Grange came to be sold, Rudyard begged as a memento the open work iron bell pull at the entrance, installing at his own home, Bateman's, quote, "in the hope that other children might also feel happy when they rang it." Beloved Ruddy remained close to Uncle Ned all his life until the artist's death in 1898. Burne-Jones acted as his referee for London's first London flat, proposed him for membership in the Athenaeum, sent 4 paintings to Vermont to decorate Nolaka, and corresponded with him to the end, while Rudyard wrote Recessional while living with his aunt and uncle in North End House in Rottingdean in 1897. It seems possible, if not certain, that the author was aware that Burne-Jones, in a career otherwise divided to oil paintings, murals, and stained glass, book illustrations, tapestries, and decorated furniture, had designed book plates, but my panel mate, Mr. Samuels Lasner, will discuss those in a few moments. Tied Up in Tales. Rudyard Kipling's first bookplate design was for himself, and this is in the Berg collection at the New York Public Library, where 4 separate designs in black ink, illustrating in one manner or another the punning caption, "Tied Up in Tales," T-A-I-L-S, parentheses, or Tales, T-A-L-E-S, close parentheses, or is it Tales of Tales? None were ever completed, and all 4 have only been reproduced together once in plates found in a book called Writings on Writing by Rudyard Kipling, published in 1996. The most elaborate, on which the caption just quoted appears, shows Rudyard's initials R and K separated by a large J. Joseph was his given first name. He dropped it, but this suggests an early date for these drawings' composition, to the left and right of which are heavily striped and fur-shaded tigers whose tails completely surround the image and end up tied in a knot at the top. On this drawing, it's not clear in the cleaned up version who wrote for his book. Better? Question mark. There's a third version that shows his initials once more, tigers in profile facing one another, and their tails once more surrounding their bodies entwined at the top. And the fourth one has tigers in a left-headed, heading full-bodied headed profile at the bottom, his tail held above his form, supporting horizontally across the image a right-heading tiger at the top, balancing on the bottom tiger's tail. If Joseph Rudyard Kipling made these bookplace designs when he was a teenager, as the use of the prominent J might suggest, it was to be roughly another 35 years before he essayed a second effort at designing an ex libris. By then, Lockwood had died in 1911 and was no longer around to counsel or critique Rudyard's artwork. All his life, Rudyard insisted, and often acted as if it were true, that his parents were the only critical audience he cared about. The author's American publisher, Frank N. Doubleday, had a daughter, Dorothy, whom Rudyard met when she was small. When Dorothy was only 6, the Kiplings had stayed with the Doubleday family at their home at Cold Spring Harbor on Long Island in June 1889, when Rudyard was recovering from the severe illness in New York City, which had taken his oldest child, Josephine, only 5 years old, when she died of the pneumonia that almost killed her father, and she's cremated and buried on Long Island. He remained friends with Dorothy all his life, Dorothy Doubleday, as can be traced through his years of correspondence with her father. 1912, he closed a letter to Frank with these words, quote, "Dear love to you all, especially Dorothy." She was then 19. Parentheses, he says, "Daughters are nice things when, as I explained to Elsie, his daughter, well behaved." To Elsie herself in 1926, he wrote, "Dorothy Doubleday, that was, has turned into a very nice woman, and we liked having her. She'd married a man named F. Huntington Babcock, May 1915, and she and her husband in 1926 had stayed at Kipling's home over a couple of days in June that year." Given the similarity in age with Josephine when she passed, it seems fair to conclude that Dorothy became something of an emotional substitute for Josephine's long grieving father, a grief he tried to exercise in They, his story about the spirit children in the Sussex woods of 1904. This next image is his first book plate for Dorothy Doubleday. He designed not one but two for her, and in them he expressed his continuing fondness for combined verbal visual funds, as he did in his never executed Tales of Tales. While neither is dated, the earliest is probably this, which reads in capital letters, "Dorothy Doubleday's Possessive," above the profile of an ocean liner, which has been several times mistakenly identified by some commentators as the Lusitania, on which Dorothy traveled with her fiance Babcock in 1914, preceding the ship's infamous torpedoing by a German submarine in May 1950. Designed in an unusual, for a bookplate, horizontal format to accommodate its main image, on each side is a rising or a setting sun showing a double day. In a 1935 lecture by a bookplate authority, Louis Stark, discussing this ex libris and the second described and shown to you in a minute, said that, quote, "They were made by Kipling for Dorothy Doubleday, the daughter of the publisher, and both are punning plates. The first shows an ocean liner between two suns just rising above the horizon. The second includes two globes showing the Western hemispheres, and on either side appears the sun with signs of the zodiac inscribed on it." He continues, "The plates are accompanied by a note from Mrs. Doubleday," insert to a bookplate bibliographer and collector some of you may know named Winward Prescott, which unfortunately, he continues, has no year date. "They were designed," says Mrs. Doubleday, he means Babcock, "by Mr. Rudyard Kipling about 3 years ago, and the two sons in them both are responsible for the avowedly feeble pun of 2 days or double day." This next image is of his second book plate and is noted in the summary I just read to you. Second design shows two globes, the lower surrounded by a sinuous cloud shape, which really bears a great resemblance to Rudyard's drawing of the alphabet necklace in Just So Stories from 1902. Above and below a band reading Ex Libris Dorothy Doubleday. The 4-quarter circles are situated around the two globes, together making up one sun, the Doubleday pun. And these quarters are inscribed with the 12 signs of the zodiac, which I won't repeat. They're all there, though. The pen and ink drawing for it, smudged and marked with straight pen marks, is signed R.K. Del Op, and it's inscribed on the back, not in Kipling's hand, but perhaps in Dorothy Doubleday's, bookplate designed by Rudyard Kipling. Unlike his father, except in the first version of his Ex Libris for his son, Rudyard signed his design. Both bookplates declare Rudyard Kipling Del Op. You can see it very small there in the lower right-hand corner. Delineavit Opus, the classical tag declaring that he or she had drawn this artwork. Years later, Mr. and Mrs. Babcock had a new bookplate made to include both their names. I guess the husband was jealous. Indeed, removing the name Doubleday completely, which destroys the punning original, altering Kipling's design, but leaving his artist's mark on the plate. Now, this treacherous version, to add insult to injury, is mistakenly presented as Rudyard's own in the British Museum publication Ex Libris, The Art of Bookplates. It's just wrong. Dorothy's note suggests that Rudyard designed both bookplates within a fairly short period of time. Start date for that period of creativity can be reasonably placed at 1915, when the voyage across the Atlantic was fresh enough a memory to make the ship reference pertinent, even if it's a ship bearing, as close examination will reveal, an American flag and with the wrong number of funnels for the Lusitania. So the second must have been completed by the end of 1916 or soon thereafter, because, and this is the last image and the last few words, Dorothy mounted it in her present from her father at Christmas that year, the Doubleday pamphlet copyright edition of Kipling's poem A Nativity, which was published on 17th January 1917, which in its original pale yellow wrappers, her father had specially bound by the company's French bindery at the publisher's headquarters in Garden City, resplendent in sumptuous green morocco with gilt lettering and 5 bands on the spine, and further ornamented, harder to see here, in a seasonal red poinsettia on the front board. I conclude in words to be found in the Oxford Dictionary of Proverbs, a motto worthy of being on a book plate: qualis pater, talis filius, as is the father, so the son. Thank you.
Okay. Audio on now?
Yes. We
Good.
can hear.
My remarks are rather a coda to Dave Richards. As he's pointed out eloquently, Rudyard Kipling was very, very attached to his aunt and uncle, Georgiana and Edward Burne-Jones. And I think that one can say that some of Rudyard Kipling's artistic talent came from his uncle as well as his father, and his mother and his aunt, who were all very, very talented people. Edward Burne-Jones, 1833 to 1898, was the preeminent pre-Raphaelite painter and one of the major artistic figures of the second half of the 19th century in Britain. Closely associated with the designer, poet, and socialist William Morris, Burne-Jones, like Lockwood Kipling, was a master of many media, primarily an oil painter in oils, a draftsman in watercolor, pencil, crayon, designer of stained glass windows, an illustrator of books, a brilliant caricaturist of himself and of others, and even delving in such quote unquote minor arts as jewelry, fashion, and women's shoes. By the time Kipling was born in 1865, Burne-Jones was still a young, upcoming painter. He had married, he was struggling, but he was becoming better known. By the time Kipling gained fame in the 1880s, his uncle was considered one of the great artists of his time. Burne-Jones's work, and there is an enormous amount of it, is found throughout Britain and American museums, collections. It is almost inconceivable to think that a single person produced so much. And oddly enough, Burne-Jones was not much of a bookplate artist. As far as I know, he produced only 3 bookplates, and as you'll see, they're all connected to one another. And he did not take any commissions for bookplates. He made none for his friends, except for the 3 that I'll speak about. And the bookplates are so little known that as far as I can recall, they have never been shown in a Burne-Jones exhibition. To bibliophiles, Burne-Jones is, of course, best known for being the illustrator of his friend Morris's Kelmscott Press in the 1890s, responsible for the 87 illustrations in the press's masterpiece, the Kelmscott Chaucer, published in 1896. So you can see that Burne-Jones had no trouble producing work that could well be turned into bookplates. Small, black and white drawings, very detailed, elaborate depictions of historical themes, classical myth, and religion. I think it's a truism to say that everyone, if certainly you're talking about culture and politics, in Britain, certainly in the late 19th century, was somehow related to everyone else. Clearly, there is a connection between the Burne-Joneses and their nephew, Rudyard Kipling, but here's a little more of an explanation that you may find interesting. Burne-Jones's wife, Georgiana, was one of the four famous MacDonald sisters. One, Alice, married Lockwood Kipling, who was the mother of Rudyard. Another married Edward Poynter, who was a classical painter, eventually president of the Royal Academy. A third, Louisa, married Albert Baldwin, who was an ironmaster from Staffordshire. They were the parents of Stanley Baldwin, British Prime Minister. And finally, the last of the MacDonald sisters was married to, and I'm just having a moment of not remembering here. We've got four of them, I guess. And they all had children. The children became themselves, in some cases, quite famous. Burne-Jones's daughter, Margaret McHale, shown in the top photograph with her brother Phil, who also became an artist, and William Morris and his wife, Jane Morris, and their daughters, Jenny and May. Angela became the novelist Angela Thirkell and wrote a wonderful book about Burne-Jones and about Kipling's called Three Houses, published in 1931. To give you an idea of the intimacy between the Burne-Joneses and the Kiplings, to build a little bit on Dave's remarks, I would like to take you back to 1897. The Burne-Jones family had a house in London called North End House, and they had a country place in the Sussex village of Rottingdean. That house was called also North End House, partly because it was named after the London residence, but also because it was in the north end of the little village. And in June 1897, Rudyard Kipling and his wife, Caroline, came to stay with Kipling's aunt and uncle in Rottingdean. Caroline was expecting, and in August, she gave birth to their son, John. This is the visitor's book from the Burne-Joneses' house in Rottingdean with the signatures of Rudyard Kipling, his wife, his young daughter, Elsie, the youngest daughter, Josephine, and just below in very tiny handwriting, Rudyard Kipling has written, and a man was sent by the Lord, and his name was John, recording the birth of the son in the Burne-Joneses' house. I believe, and Dave may correct me, that this is the only known signature of Josephine Kipling, who, as Dave said, died in New York in 1899. On the right is North End House, which, by the way, is on the market for £950,000. The Kiplings, soon after John's birth, rented a house across the pond from the Burne-Joneses and remained in Rottingdean for a couple of years until the gawkers and the tourists drove them away further into Sussex. Burne-Jones's bookplates were made for members of the Horner family. But we have to start a little earlier with a man named William Graham, one of the merchant princes of Glasgow, who made his fortune first in textiles and then importing port. Graham's port is still made today, though the family apparently does not own the firm. William Graham was a rather conservative businessman. He did not particularly move in society in London, but he had a great deal of money and he loved art. He collected Renaissance paintings and particularly the work of the Pre-Raphaelites, Dante Gabriel Rossetti and Burne-Jones and the rest of the artists in their circle. Graham was Burne-Jones's principal patron during the 1870s, and the Grahams and the Burne-Joneses became very, very close friends. Burne-Jones was particularly taken with, and I would use the word enamored of, Graham's daughter, Frances, who was born in 1854. It's been said that there were three important women in Burne-Jones's life: his wife, his lover, Marie Zambacco, and Frances Graham. And here's a portrait of her by Burne-Jones. He wrote her a great many letters. He saw her very often from a very early age and watched her grow up. She appears in a number of his works, including the famous Golden Stairs on the left, where she is the young woman with a pair of cymbals on the lower left. Burne-Jones executed many commissions for the Graham family, including this elaborate painted piano. Frances married Sir John Horner in 1883. He was a direct descendant of the 17th century Horner, who is thought to have inspired the nursery rhyme. He was a landowner. He was a man whose life seemed devoted to those of what used to be called country pursuits. Frances was not that young when she married him, and there's always been a mystery about the particular attachment. Burne-Jones was somewhat devastated to lose Frances, but continued to socialize with them and with members of the Souls, the upper class intellectuals and artists who formed a coterie around the future Prime Minister, Asquith. It appears that, as I said, that everyone in England is related to everyone else. And to give you a good example of this, there's Frances Horner on the upper left, and her daughter Catherine married Asquith's son, and thus became the great aunt of Helena Bonham Carter. The Horner estate, Mells Park, suffered a serious fire in 1917. The house was eventually rebuilt, but the Horners fell on somewhat hard times in the early years of the 20th century. Frances Horner had a kind of career as both a social hostess and a patron of the arts, knowing the younger generation of writers, musicians, and painters, figures such as William Nicholson and William Walton in her later years. On the right is a picture of Mells Park, which happily they were able to pull many of the valuable artworks, including paintings by Burne-Jones, from the flames in 1917. Burne-Jones apparently produced Frances Horner's bookplate either as a wedding gift or soon after her marriage. The first design was of a sailing ship shown here in the middle. And I like to think that this particular kind of Viking craft influenced Rudyard Kipling's own particular interest in that kind of boat. Burne-Jones used the motif in a great many artworks, ranging from stained glass on the left, made for a house in Newport, Rhode Island called Vinland, now without any arts and crafts decor, but a showplace for Morris and Company, which decorated it in the early 1800s. Similar ship in the Holy Grail tapestry designed by Burne-Jones. You'll see a couple more versions of the ship later on. I don't know why Burne-Jones had this particular theme through so much of his work. His friend Morris, of course, was a translator of Old Norse sagas and visited Iceland twice. Burne-Jones seemed to have spent a lot of time making fun of Morris. He also did cartoons and caricatures of his friends sailing in such vessels, including one in which his friend Sir George Lewis was shown heaving over the side during a very bumpy cross-channel trip. The actual bookplate for Francis Horner derives from this drawing seen on the left, and on the right is the finished plate produced by wood engraving, possibly with some photographic work in between the original drawing and the final printed product. The theme is typical of Burne-Jones, the pair of cherubs, the simple lettering. It's very similar to the device that Burne-Jones made for the first edition of Morris's Earthly Paradise in 1868. Burne-Jones's second bookplate, appropriately, was for the first child of Sir John and Frances, Lady Horner, Cecily, born in 1883. Like Kipling, Burne-Jones seemed to have had an interest in producing bookplates for children. Burne-Jones died in 1898, so at the most, Cecily was only 15 at the time, and probably the bookplate dates from a few years earlier. Here is a simple motif of flowers, a vase, and her name. This is an extraordinarily rare bookplate, both in books and sort of as a separate item, very, very collectible. A third Burne-Jones bookplate was supposedly made for another member of the Horner family, but I have not been able to identify it or find out anything more. There's a reference in a letter, but a more distant member than one of Francis and Sir John's children. The third Burne-Jones bookplate was made for Pamela Margaret Jekyll, who was the daughter of Francis Horner's sister, Agnes, who had married Sir Herbert Jekyll, a civil servant, and the younger brother of Gertrude Jekyll, the landscape designer. And again, this is a bookplate for a young person. She was born in 1889. Burne-Jones died in 1898, so she was perhaps 7 at the most when the bookplate was made. And this is very similar to the Francis Horner bookplate. A photograph of Pamela Jekyll and her husband, Sir Herbert, and they are, and her husband, Herbert Asquith, who was the son of the Prime Minister of Great Britain. McKenna served as Chancellor of the Exchequer and later as Home Secretary during Asquith's administration in the First World War. There's a mystery about this bookplate design. It is supposedly a drawing by Burne-Jones for his own bookplate, executed when he was awarded a baronetcy in 1894. It comes from the papers of Robert Catterson Smith, an artist, an art teacher who had assisted Burne-Jones in preparing the illustrations for the Kelmscott Press. On the back is a note that says, by Burne-Jones, but it's really not clear if Burne-Jones made the design. It's heraldic. It has what is supposed to be the Burne-Jones family motto on it. But frankly, it doesn't look entirely like Burne-Jones's work. The pencil drawing, however, is rather in his style, as are the little squiggles around it. What is certain is that the bookplate was never made. What survives is this drawing on the left and an ink drawing by Robert Catterson Smith, in which he developed the original design in pen and ink to be reproduced as a bookplate. This was recently on the market. I don't know where it is now, and deserves further study. That Burne-Jones may have had ideas for other bookplates derives from the fact that there are designs like these in what he called his secret book of drawings or secret book of designs held by the British Museum. And you'll see these are very book-like looking sketches. And there again is the Burne-Jones Viking ship prominently displayed, as it was in the Horner bookplate and very, very small size in Pamela Jekyll's bookplate. In the end, Burne-Jones had his own bookplate, produced at the very end of his life by his friend William Morris at the Kelmscott Press. Like all the Kelmscott Press bookplates, it is simple typography. There are no illustrations, no ornaments. They're all of a pattern, and they're in the golden type, designed by William Morris, and they were all printed between 1896 and the closing of the press in 1898. Burne-Jones barely had time to put it into any of his books because he died 6 months after the bookplate was produced. It's found in books from his library, including his copy, which first belonged to William Morris, of the Hypnerotomachia Polyphilis, printed by Aldus in 1499, one of the most magnificent Renaissance illustrated books. You can see on the right one of the illustrations from the Hypnerotomachia Polyphilis and one of Burne-Jones's illustrations for William Morris's Story of Cupid and Psyche, a project that they started in the mid-1860s and never completed. Burne-Jones producing 44 illustrations to this particular story that were engraved and printed various times during Burne-Jones and Morris's lifetimes, and then afterwards. And you can see the influence of this great book on Burne-Jones as he had it in hand doing the Cupid and Psyche designs. What strikes me is how curious it is that Burne-Jones's bookplate is in a book of such magnificence, and below it is a bookplate of astonishing ugliness from Harvard College's library with the name of the donor typewritten, presumably on an IBM Selectric or similar at one point or another. It's almost a sacrilege. I'd like to close by saying that Burne-Jones's bookplates, distinctive as they are not really his best work, but they deserve further attention, and more may turn up in due course. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, David. So we'll turn to the Q&A portion of tonight's talk. And if you could either raise your actual hand or raise a Zoom hand or type something in the chat, we can turn to you right away.
Start by asking Mark a question.
No.
Cheryl Hurley. Yes, Cheryl, you can go ahead and unmute and go ahead, yes.
I do have a question. I just want to say what a wonderful talk this was, how scholarly, how informed, the breadth of it was fascinating, and I salute our speakers. Thank you. We're great, and your nice introduction as well. Thank you.
I echo that. I'm seeing some questions in the chat, one from David Solo. Would you like to pose it, or I can read for you?
Doesn't matter. For David, when you showed the 1894 and 1909 versions of the elephant book plate, you mentioned in the first one that the eye was almost covered, but then I noticed that in the second one, it looked to be completely covered by the blanket over the head of the elephant. I was just wondering if there was any significance in sort of having the eye completely disappear in the second version.
David, I'm abashed to say that I hadn't noticed that. I was too busy doing what direction was the bell hanging in, and Kipling's mustache and the rest. So I can't tell you. It could well be oh, you're right.
I'm gonna pull it up. So this is the
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe that's Lockwood's joke about Rudyard didn't know where he was going. That, I wouldn't put that. I wouldn't. I mean, we're counting entirely on the Mahout to direct this one, but I don't know. That's a good question, and I don't understand. I don't know.
Fair enough. Thanks. That was a great talk. Thank you.
Well, glad you enjoyed it.
Great. Mike Lampert.
Hi, so my question is just simply, in his too brief life, did Rudyard's boy Jack show any of the artistic talent of his father or his grandfather?
Not that we know of. He didn't have much chance. Rudyard's terrible eyesight passed down to his son. He couldn't get him in the Navy. He pulled strings with Field Marshal Lord Roberts, who is the patron of the Irish Guards. And they got John in, and the first time he went over the top, rather like a second lieutenant in Vietnam, he was killed, and the body was never found, and it broke the Kipling's hearts and spirits. But no, he had such a brief life, no career. He had problems in school, disciplinary problems. Lots of letters about that from Kipling to the headmaster. But I don't know of any particular artistic talent. Whereas one thing in my collection, which got reprinted in the Kipling Journal, was a drawing, an elaborate drawing Rudyard did at Westward Ho, his prep school, when he was, I don't know, 11 or 12, called in Old English, Ye Broken Bussa, BUSSE. And so he practiced drawing, inspired by his father or not. And he wasn't with his father when he did that, when he was at school. But I know of no particular artistic talent of John's. He was much loved. He was the baby of the family. If you've ever seen, or I don't know, maybe it's on YouTube, PBS BBC did a movie a few years back called My Boy Jack.
Yeah, no, I did see that.
Right, and its thesis is wrong. I did a panel at the Museum of Television where the BBC producer from PBS in Boston basically shut me up because I was incendiary. But the notion of the movie was that his father was a rabid empire jingoist and forced young John to enlist. And that totally ignores, which made for great drama, but it ignores the fact that 100,000 young men enlisted between August and Christmas, thinking it was going to be all over by Christmas. That was what they were told. And as Carrie Kipling wrote to a neighbor, what else could we do? The boy wanted to go, and how could they, keep their son safe? So he had a short life and a long search for his body, of which there's still controversy whether he was ever found or not. Although his name is now one of the grave sites carved with all the others. But it quite broke Kipling, and he spent 3 years interviewing John's military buddies at his home. He wrote a 2-volume work called The Irish Guards. He has one sentence in it about his son, and he told his secretary it was his greatest work. And none of you have ever heard of it.
Susan has a question. Please go ahead.
Who?
Susan?
Oh, I didn't know I was on. Yes, oh, I thought your remarks were wonderful, both Mark Samuels Lasner and David Richards. Thank you so much. What I conclude from your remarks is that the initial statement you made is that the literary and an elitist part of England is indeed all related. Would you agree?
Well, Mark would know better, but this, and I'll just fill out a little bit about the MacDonald sisters. This was quite extraordinary. There are 4 sisters, and one marries Edward Burne-Jones. One marries Edward Poynter, who is the head of the Royal Academy. The third one marries a British industrialist, and their son becomes prime minister. And then Alice MacDonald marries the runt of the litter and goes into exile in India with her husband. And her child is the most famous of them all, of the second generation. Baldwin kept trying to give honors to Rudyard, but other prime ministers had too, and he never accepted it from anybody because he wanted to say nasty things. And if he were poet laureate, he couldn't say nasty things. And he said some really unpleasant things. There's a poem some of you may know called the Gehazi about the Marconi scandal, in which he celebrates the fact that the protagonist with the biblical model, a judge of Israel, is dying of throat cancer. So he kept his independence that way. And then Mark has pointed out the descendants down on the Thurkel and other sides. So obviously the artistic genes were pretty strong. And anyone that studied Victorian England knows that there was where there were an aristocratic coterie, and there was an artistic coterie, and then there was sort of everybody else. But the stories are quite remarkable, and the interrelations and the influences, which Mark and I were both trying to describe, are quite real.
Phenomenal. Yes.
If I sounded slightly confused about the relationship of the parts of the Horner family, it's because I am. If you look up any one of them on Wikipedia, you will be seeing links to all the other ones, and you could spend probably several days just connecting. If you start with Frances Horner and her sister, you will get to enormous numbers of people who were significant in British politics and culture for the last 100 years. Helena Bonham Carter is just one of them. Even while sort of looking them up, I found people that I had never heard of. Reginald McKenna's nephew was a writer named Stephen McKenna, who published something like 40 books, which I don't think anyone has read in the last 50 years. But it is astonishing. And if you think of the people who would go to a party, if you were thinking, okay, a party at, the Horners Mells Park in the 1880s or 1890s could have included, everything from Burne-Jones and John Singer Sargent to Ellen Terry to lots of people with aristocratic titles, all in the same place at the same time.
And I can confirm, Mark, that that is certainly the only known physical mark of Josephine.
That's what I always, that's what I thought.
And the age, she would have been very young at that time. I would suppose perhaps an adult held her hand as
Yeah,
that was done.
yeah.
Emily was younger, and that was in script, so that clearly was written by someone else. But that page is of that book in your collection is in danger.
Yeah, I know.
I had a question for Dave Richards.
Yes, Mr.
Hello,
Wynn.
Dave. John Windle here. How are
Yes, I remember.
you? How would
Nice haircut, John.
Thank you. How would you describe the current state of Kipling's reputation in our politically correct world today, given that he's gone from, hero to villain to mixture of both? And how is he now regarded by current young scholars like Olivia, for example, who perhaps has never read Kipling? I don't know. What is his standing currently?
Well, I've never recovered from your Blake lecture 7 years ago, where you said there were more Blake quotations in Bartlett's than Kipling's. I've been struggling with that ever since.
Sad but true.
It may even be true. Well, no, certainly he was quite extraordinary in his time, and is the only person that might legitimately, the only author that might legitimately be compared with Charles Dickens as being both a critical favorite and a popular favorite. And he was the wealthiest writer in English when he died. Favored, of course, by having massive sales both here and in England, or through the British Empire. But to come directly to your question, he was, even before woke post-colonial scholarship, on the wrong side of history with regard to Northern Ireland, with regard to India. In both these, he was at one with Churchill, who used to sit at Chartwell and declaim Kipling across the lake behind the house. Mark's good friend, Max Beerbaum, whom Mark consulted with personally in doing that bibliography, I think, of course, ripped a new one in Kipling regularly. Even though T.S. Eliot was a vice president of the Kipling Society, and I will now outrank him as of July, when he published Kipling's verse, he said it was a choice of Kipling's verse. He was twisting the knife. He didn't think that it was quite poetry. And so Kipling both got overwhelmed by the end and the bitterness of empire. He got overwhelmed by the modernism of Beerbaum and of Eliot. And we all know Robert Frost, the crack about writing poetry that doesn't rhyme is playing tennis without a net. But I think things are shifting. He hasn't had any statues dumped into the bay so far. There are Indians who say that Kim is the greatest thing about India written by an Englishman. I don't think that's going to change. Obviously, tastes differ in literature, but he's the first person writing in the English language to win a Nobel Prize in English, in literature. And his short stories now are being more hailed by critical opinion from the 1950s now. He's seen as almost Chekhovian. He wasn't much of a novel writer. Kim is a picaresque story, not really a novel. But he has his fans, and most interestingly, seen as a cultural critic and a describer of a world we still live in. It's very rare for a week or two to go by without Kipling being quoted in The Economist or the New York Times. There was, at the time of the Gulf War, the British troops had T-shirts made up down in Basra, and they were inscribed with the last stanza of the poem, The Young British Soldier, which goes something like, when you're wounded and lying on Afghanistan's plains, and the women come out to cut up what remains, just roll to your rifle and blow out your brains and go to your death like a soldier. They thought that was morbid and hilarious and somehow spirit affirming. And if you go back and look at something like The Female of the Species, that really makes mock of men. It was seen as an attack on the suffragettes, but what it actually says is women do things. Men sit around the fire and talk about it, but women will kill you if you threaten their child. And so, I think he deserves a second look. And all the Victorians are sliding away, however many dams Mark and I might try to throw up. But I'm, delighted to know that there was a Keats conference. So maybe there's hope in the next century. But he's still maybe behind John Blake, but still eminently quotable, and people enjoy his poetry, and he still has lots of fans. But the last American to write a book about him was something like The Unknown Kipling, written by a professor at I think it was Vassar, one of the seven cities, a couple of years ago. And he apologized for writing a book about Kipling.
I'd love to hear what Olivia has to say. If you take a phrase like one of his most famous lines, "You're a better man than I am, Gunga Din."
Mm-hmm.
Cultural appropriation, utterly demeaning. When I was a child, these were inspirational, wonderful verses. Now I think, well, let's hear from Olivia.
Yeah, I would follow up on what David is saying, just from the scholarly point of view. I agree. I can't think of the latest, monograph on Kipling that's been published. It's certainly not winning any Victorian book prizes or the one that we judged. What I would say is that it's not as if certain of these authors are off limits, right? So that I see grad students, especially international grad students, maybe engaging with authors, but coming at it from a post-colonial point of view, or even, Indian scholars who love British literature and are trying to engage with this work or make sense of it. I think the onus is really on the scholar to make sure that they're coming at it with a lot of awareness and knowledge about any references that they're engaging with. I guess I would compare it to something like Joseph Conrad, right? An author who's problematic, but people are still willing to engage with them. And I wouldn't say that these great canonical writers are not having their limelight. I mean, David, when you mentioned, Keats, Shelley, Byron, they're all written on very much so now by young scholars, grad students. And I think a lot of that has to do with associations like the William Morris Society, Byron Study. The KSAA has been great in really staying updated, supporting young scholars at conferences, having graduate essay prizes, and really engaging with, fields like critical race studies and post-colonial studies to kind of keep that alive. So I think that's been really important in terms of keeping the scholarship salient and current, and keeping younger students interested in it. I mean, things like the white man's burden, they're always taught in survey courses, usually as kind of in a caricaturing, mocking tone, or to teach that lesson. But I think students would still recognize it.
I also had a quick question for Mark. Hello, Mark.
Hello, John.
Mark, do you have a book plate?
I do.
Who designed it?
Sebastian Carter. So it's simple calligraphy. And actually there's an earlier one which reproduces Rossetti, Dr. Gabriel Rossetti's frontispiece to Christina Rossetti's Goblin Market, which is which I had made because it has the wombat in it. But, well, I was going to say that, you know, it is, if you are attempt to judge and not, you know, try to understand, try to look at the writers of the late 19th century. And if you look at their writings, if you look at the correspondence, there are plenty of awful, hateful things that they wrote and sometimes said. And that does not necessarily mean you shouldn't read or appreciate them. But as Olivia says, you need to come at them with awareness. I used to think that if I removed every objectionable writer from my collection, I would be left with probably Mrs. Beeton's Guide to Cookery, the Bradshaw's Railway Guide, and something, I don't know, something else, but I'm not even sure what the third book would be. Because every, you know, people that you admire, you think they were geniuses, they were wonderful. Well, reading Beatrix Potter's diaries, her political opinions would even in their day have been reactionary. But that's not going to stop anyone from appreciating Peter Rabbit.
John Windle's point, towards the end of the 19th century, Kipling went down to Cape Town, to the University of Cape Town, which is my alma mater. And his two closest friends there apparently were Cecil John Rhodes and Leander Jameson of Jameson Raid fame. Within the last 5 years, the statue of Cecil John Rhodes has been toppled at the university, and Jameson Hall has been renamed. And both are felt by today's standards to have been rabid racists at the time. So those associations don't help either.
Well,
William Shakespeare is objectionable. God help us all.
He built a house for Kipling. Kipling stayed there on the Woolsack.
Correct, that's right.
Harry Kipling advised Rhodes that he should add 50 quid to the Rhodes Scholarship because the Americans weren't going to be able to go home. They wouldn't have enough money. And perhaps more confounding, when Kipling published the poem, If, it followed a story about George Washington. And so for years, the thought was, since he paired his poems with his stories, and that was a characteristic way of his putting out his work, it was thought that If was about George Washington. It wasn't. It was about Leander Jameson. Kipling, I have one of the 3 copies known. The other is in the National Library of Zimbabwe of his 2-stanza poem on the death of Rhodes. He was a good friend of Rhodes. I've just finished an article for a conference. We do have them on Kipling at City University in London in September on Kipling and journalism, about his being a reporter on the British newspaper for Lord Roberts, who got his son into the army 14 years later, called The Friend. But he was quite bitter that the British had given so much to the Boers because of the way they treated the Afrikaners, because they treated what they called Kaffirs very badly. And so you have to know that before you start dumping on Kipling for his association with Rhodes. He thought he was a great man. So did a lot of British politicians. They were perfectly happy to scoot him along. But we have all kinds of retrospective justice now, and sometimes it's not pretty. And when I made a reference to statues being thrown into the water, I meant the one in Bristol of the slaveholder who was a hero there. Kipling had 2 sides to his head. His first language was Hindi, and probably was less racist than most people of his time, as far as people of color. And you have to understand the language. Gunga Din's been quoted. Another line is, he was white, clear white inside. That meant he was an honorable person. You have to understand the language before you come out with the criticism, and a lot of more casual critics haven't done that. But you're right. He did have friends like that on the more muscular side of British Empire, and to the extent that that's now seen by a lot of people. Niall Ferguson is attacked for his book on the British Empire. There are many books now about how awful the British were in India, and they aren't bad books. They aren't fake news. He was a man of his time, less anti-Semitic than most of the Edwardians, but a racist, not particularly. Have we exhausted everyone?
Perhaps so. I want to take this opportunity to thank David Allen Richards and Mark Samuels Lassner for a wonderful talk. Thank you everyone for coming. And I also want to give a shout out to Eve Kahn for lining up an amazing series in this virtual world this year. Thank you, Eve. And also Ilir for taking on all the tech difficulties. And of course, Eric Holzenberg for starting us off here. Thanks everyone. Have a wonderful evening. We'll see you at the next event.
Good night.
Bye.
Thank you. Elizabeth.
Thanks. Take care, everyone.
You feel better. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, David.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Excellent, Mark and David. Thank you.
Welcome.
That was